The rain fell in heavy sheets on the day of the funeral, as if the sky itself was mourning. Grace stood under a black umbrella, watching strangers place flowers on her husband's casket. She was 42 years old, and today she had become a widow. Just 1 week ago, she and Robert had been planning their summer vacation. Now she was planning the rest of her life without him. He was a good man, someone whispered as they squeezed her arm. Grace nodded automatically, the same way she had been nodding for hours. Good man, great colleague, wonderful friend. The words washed over her like the rain, cold and somehow not quite touching her. Thank you for coming, she replied, not recognizing the man in the expensive suit who had spoken to her. There were so many people she didn't know, colleagues from Robert's investment firm who spoke about him as if they knew him better than she did. After 15 years of marriage, Grace had thought she knew everything about her husband, but looking at the crowded church, she wasn't so sure anymore. The heart attack had come without warning. 1 minute Robert was mowing the lawn on a sunny Saturday morning, and the next, their neighbor was pounding on the door, saying Robert had collapsed. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. The doctors said it was quick, that he wouldn't have suffered much. As if that was supposed to be a comfort. Back at the house after the burial, Grace moved through the rooms like a ghost. Friends had brought food, casseroles, sandwiches, cakes, but she couldn't eat. Her sister had offered to stay, but Grace needed to be alone. She needed to process what had happened, needed to understand how her life had shattered so completely in just a few days. She wandered into their bedroom and sat on Robert's side of the bed, running her hand over his pillow. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, next to the mystery novel he would never finish. The bookmark was stuck somewhere in the middle, forever marking the place where his story had ended. What am I supposed to do now? She whispered to the empty room. Their house, which had always felt just the right size, now seemed both too empty and too full, empty of his presence but overflowing with reminders of him. His coffee mug in the kitchen, his jacket still hanging by the door. The stack of mail addressed to him that kept arriving, as if the world hadn't gotten the memo that Robert Johnson no longer existed. Grace picked up their wedding photo from the dresser. They looked so young, so certain that they had all the time in the world. She tried to reconcile that smiling man with the closed casket she had just watched being lowered into the ground. It didn't seem possible that they were the same person. As the evening wore on, Grace found herself standing in the hallway, staring at the door at the far end. Robert's home office. The room he had claimed 3 years ago when he started bringing more work home. The room he always kept locked. Sensitive client information, he had explained with a smile. Company policy. Grace had never questioned it. She had respected his privacy the same way he had respected hers. But now, looking at that closed door, she felt a strange uneasiness. What was behind it? What parts of Robert's life had been sealed away from her? A text message interrupted her thoughts. It was from Robert's boss, offering condolences again and asking when she might be available to clear out his desk at the office. There were personal effects to be collected, the message said. Grace wondered what those effects might be. What small pieces of her husband's daily life had she never seen? As she replied to the message, promising to come to the office later that week, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something she didn't understand. The locked office door seemed to watch her, holding secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to discover. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The bed was too big, too empty without Robert's steady breathing beside her. She got up around 3 in the morning and made herself tea, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. On the fridge, held by a magnet, was their monthly calendar. Robert had circled next week's date, their anniversary. 16 years would have been celebrated with dinner at their favorite restaurant. Instead, Grace found herself a widow, surrounded by sympathy cards and casseroles, with a growing suspicion that the man she had buried today might have been a stranger all along. And somewhere in the house, behind a locked door, were answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find. 2 weeks after the funeral, Grace still hadn't touched the locked door at the end of the hallway. She would walk past it several times a day, sometimes pausing, her hand hovering near the knob before dropping back to her side. That door had become a barrier between her old life and whatever waited on the other side. You need to start going through his things, her sister had told her on the phone that morning. It might help with closure. Closure, such a neat little word for the mess of emotions that tangled inside her chest. Grace wasn't sure she wanted closure yet. Closure meant accepting that Robert was really gone. She had cleared out his desk at the investment firm last week. It had been an oddly impersonal experience. His workspace was tidy, with few personal touches, just a small plant that was already dying and a single photo of Grace in a silver frame. His coworkers had watched her pack up the meager belongings, their eyes filled with pity. One woman had hugged her and whispered, "He talked about you all the time." The words should have been comforting, but they felt hollow. If Robert had talked about her all the time, why did none of these people seem familiar? Now, standing in front of the locked door at home, Grace took a deep breath. She had found the key yesterday while sorting through Robert's dresser drawer. A small silver key on a plain ring, tucked inside a sock. Not hidden exactly, but not in plain sight either. "It's just a room," she told herself, sliding the key into the lock. "Just an office." The key turned smoothly, and the door swung open with a soft creak. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, not sure what she had expected to find. Something dramatic perhaps, evidence of some secret life or shameful habit. Instead, she was greeted by a perfectly ordinary-looking office. Too ordinary, almost. Too neat. She stepped inside, flipping on the light switch. The room was immaculate. A desk with a closed laptop. A bookshelf with perfectly aligned books. Filing cabinets against one wall. Everything dusted and organized with a precision that seemed at odds with the man who regularly lost his car keys and left wet towels on the bathroom floor. "This doesn't make sense," Grace whispered to the empty room. Robert had never been this organized in their 15 years together. He was the type of person who would spend 20 minutes looking for glasses that were pushed up on his head. Yet this space was maintained with military precision. Grace moved to the desk and ran her finger along its surface. Not a speck of dust. The desk calendar was turned to the current month, with neat handwriting marking appointments and deadlines. She recognized Robert's handwriting, but not the careful precision of it. His grocery lists and birthday cards had always been scrawled in hurried, barely legible script. The filing cabinets were labeled by year, going back a decade. Grace pulled open the top drawer of the nearest one. Inside were hanging folders, each one labeled with dates and locations. She pulled out the first folder and opened it. Bank statements. But not for their joint account. This was an account she had never seen before, with a balance that made her breath catch. The next folder contained property tax information for a condo in Boston. They didn't own property in Boston. Grace's hands began to shake. She closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, then moved to the bookshelf. The books were organized by subject: finance, real estate, international travel. Many had notes in the margins, always in that same careful handwriting she barely recognized as Robert's. The laptop sat on the desk like a challenge. Grace stared at it for a long moment before settling into the desk chair and opening it. The screen lit up, requesting a password. Of course. She tried their anniversary date. Access denied. Their wedding date. Access denied. Robert's birthday. Access denied. Frustrated, Grace began opening the desk drawers. The top one contained typical office supplies: pens, paper clips, sticky notes. The middle drawer held a stack of business cards, all with Robert's name, but with different job titles than the one she knew. The bottom drawer was locked. Another locked drawer in an already locked room, Grace muttered, suddenly angry. What had Robert been hiding that required so many layers of secrecy? She returned to the filing cabinets, methodically opening drawers and scanning folders. Each one revealed another piece of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. There were bank accounts she'd never heard of, investments she'd never been told about, properties in cities they'd never visited together. On the wall behind the desk hung a corkboard with maps of 3 different cities: Boston, Chicago, and their own city. Each map had colored pins marking locations: red, blue, green. Some pins had dates written beside them. Grace leaned closer, trying to make sense of the pattern, but it was like looking at a code she didn't have the key for. As the afternoon light faded to evening, Grace sat surrounded by folders and papers, the neat room now in disarray from her searching. She felt dizzy with questions. Who was this meticulous person who had created this space? How could this be the same man who had forgotten their 10th anniversary and had to rush out for gas station flowers? The same man who could never remember to pay the electric bill on time. Grace gathered the papers into a stack and placed them on the desk. She would need time to sort through everything properly. Time to understand what all of this meant. She stood in the doorway before leaving, looking back at the room that had been locked away from her for 3 years. "Who were you, Robert?" she whispered, pulling the door closed behind her. That night, she dreamed of doors. Dozens of them, lining a long hallway, each one locked, each key hidden in a different place. And behind every door, another version of her husband waiting to be discovered. Morning light streamed through the blinds as Grace sat cross-legged on the floor of Robert's secret office, surrounded by open folders and scattered papers. She had been there since dawn, unable to sleep, her mind racing with questions that kept multiplying. 3 cups of cold coffee sat forgotten on the desk above her. What struck her most wasn't just what she had found, but how carefully everything had been arranged. Robert, who could barely remember to put the milk back in the fridge, had maintained this room with surgical precision. Not a paperclip out of place, not a speck of dust on any surface. It was as if a completely different person had occupied this space. "How did you even have time for this?" she whispered, sorting through another stack of documents. Grace had called in sick to work today. Her co-workers had been understanding, still in the sympathetic phase where everything was excused by her new widow status. But she hadn't stayed home to cry or rest. She needed answers. The filing cabinets had yielded their first secrets yesterday, but there was so much more to explore. Today, she was methodically working through each folder, creating piles on the floor, bank statements, property records, travel receipts, identity documents. The identity documents were what scared her the most. In one folder, she had found a passport with Robert's photo but a different name. William Turner. The birth date was wrong too, making William 3 years younger than Robert. There were driver's licenses from 2 different states, none of which they had ever lived in. Credit cards with names she didn't recognize. "This can't be legal," Grace muttered, examining a social security card that couldn't possibly be legitimate. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? My dead husband had fake IDs. She wasn't ready to share this with anyone yet. Not until she understood what it all meant. Grace stood up and stretched, her back aching from hours on the floor. She moved to the corkboard with its maps and pins. Looking at it more carefully now, she realized each color seemed to represent a different schedule or routine. Red pins marked weekly events, mostly in their own city. Blue pins were concentrated in Boston, with dates suggesting monthly visits. Green pins in Chicago appeared every 2 months. "Were you traveling to these places?" she asked the empty room. "Is that why you were working late so often?" Robert's business trips had increased over the last few years. Grace had never questioned them. His job in investment banking required client meetings. Sometimes he'd be gone for days, calling each night to check in, telling her about boring meetings and hotel room service. She had trusted him completely. The desk drawer with business cards revealed more personas. Robert Jenkins, financial consultant. William Turner, real estate developer. David Miller, investment strategist. All with different company names, different addresses, different phone numbers. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up her phone and dialed the number on one of the cards. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. "Turner Properties, how may I direct your call?" Grace hung up immediately, her heart pounding. It was real. The company existed. This wasn't just some elaborate prank or hobby. 4 days had passed since Grace first unlocked the door to Robert's secret office. 4 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, as she pieced together the fragments of a life she hadn't known existed. The dining room table had become her command center, covered with neatly arranged piles of documents, sticky notes, and her own handwritten timeline of events. "I'm going to need a bigger table," she muttered, adding another bank statement to an already towering stack. The bank statements alone told a story that made her stomach twist. There were 3 separate accounts she'd never known about, one for each city on the maps. Regular deposits, regular withdrawals, substantial balances. How had Robert managed this kind of money without her knowing? Their joint account had always seemed sufficient but not excessive. They had argued about vacation expenses and home repairs like any normal couple. Yet here was evidence that Robert had access to funds that could have easily covered those costs 10 times over. Grace picked up one of the property deeds she had found. a waterfront condo in Boston, purchased 5 years ago under the name William Turner. The mortgage payments came from the Boston account. The deed included a signature that looked like Robert's but wasn't quite right, more careful, more deliberate, as if he had been practicing a different way to write his name. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her sister. "Hey, how are you holding up?" her sister asked, concern evident in her voice. "I'm fine," Grace lied, staring at the papers spread before her. "Just busy with paperwork. You know, insurance forms, bank stuff. All the things they don't tell you about when someone dies. Do you need help? I could come over this weekend." "No," Grace said too quickly. "I mean, no thanks. I need to do this myself. Part of the process, you know." After promising to call if she needed anything, Grace hung up and returned to her investigation. She couldn't tell anyone what she was doing, not yet. How could she explain that the man everyone had loved and respected, the man whose funeral had been attended by dozens of tearful friends and colleagues, had been living a carefully constructed lie? The property deeds were the most disturbing evidence so far. In addition to the Boston condo, there was an apartment in Chicago under the name David Miller. Both properties were in upscale neighborhoods, both furnished and maintained year-round according to the bills she had found. Both had separate utilities, internet services, even streaming accounts, all paid regularly from their respective bank accounts. "Were you living in these places when you told me you were on business trips?" Grace asked the empty room, her voice cracking slightly. "Who were you when you were there?" She pulled out her laptop and searched for the addresses. Both buildings had sophisticated websites with photos of luxury amenities, doormen, fitness centers, roof decks. She could picture Robert there, walking through marble lobbies, riding in elevators with mirrored walls, using keys to apartments she had never seen. But why maintain separate homes? The question had been circling in her mind for days. The most obvious answer made her feel physically ill, other women. Yet she had found no evidence of that, no love letters, no photos, no suggestive messages. The bills and receipts showed single-person patterns, one coffee in the morning, one takeout dinner at night. It didn't make sense. Next to the property deeds was a folder containing passport photos of Robert with different names. The photos looked professional, the kind taken for official documents. In each one, Robert looked slightly different hairstyle, different glasses, different expression. It was still unmistakably him, but as if he were trying on different versions of himself. The passport for William Turner showed stamps for international travel, London, Zurich, Singapore, business destinations. The dates matched times when Robert had told her he was at conferences in Chicago or Boston. He hadn't just been living double lives in different American cities. He had been traveling internationally under false names. Grace got up and paced the room, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The scope of the deception was overwhelming. This wasn't just a secret bank account or an occasional lie about working late. This was a carefully orchestrated second life, no, third life, maintained over years. She returned to the table and picked up one of the business cards. Robert Jenkins, financial consultant. Her husband's real name, but a different company than the one she knew he worked for. She had already called the number and confirmed the company existed. Tomorrow, she planned to visit their offices in person to see if anyone there knew the man she had been married to. As the evening grew later, Grace found herself sorting through receipts. Restaurants, hotels, gift shops, each one dated and labeled with a city. Many of the restaurant receipts were for 2 people, so there were others involved in whatever this was. Colleagues? Friends? Lovers? A knot formed in her throat as she picked up a jewelry store receipt from Boston. A pearl necklace purchased 3 years ago for an amount that would have represented a significant splurge in their household budget. Grace had never received a pearl necklace from Robert, so who had? She pushed the receipt away, suddenly not wanting to know the answer. But she had gone too far to stop now. The truth, however painful, was better than the growing web of questions. In the kitchen, Grace poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. Through the window, she could see the neighbors' houses, lights glowing in windows, families going about their normal evening routines. How many of them were living lies? How many had secret rooms and hidden identities? Back at the dining table, she picked up a stack of utility bills for the Chicago apartment. The most recent one was dated just 2 weeks before Robert's death. Whatever life he had been living there, he had maintained it right up until the end. Grace rubbed her tired eyes. Tomorrow, she would visit Robert's real office, or what she had always thought was his real office. She would ask more questions, look for inconsistencies, search for any connections to these other lives he had been leading. For now, though, she needed rest. She carefully arranged the papers back into their folders, not wanting to risk mixing up the growing paper trails she was following. Each document was a breadcrumb leading her deeper into a forest of deception, and somewhere in that forest was the truth about the man she had married. 1 week after discovering Robert's secret office, Grace sat cross-legged on their bed, staring at his laptop. After days of failed attempts, she had finally cracked the password last night. It wasn't any of their special dates or names. It was their wedding anniversary followed by the name Elena, a name Grace had never heard Robert mention in 15 years of marriage. "Who are you, Elena?" Grace whispered, opening the laptop again. The screen lit up, revealing a desktop with neatly organized folders. Unlike the cluttered desktop of the computer Robert had used in their home office, this one was methodical. Folders were labeled by year, by city, by project. There was nothing random or casual about any of it. Grace clicked on a folder labeled Personal. Inside were more folders: Family, Travel, Correspondence. With a deep breath, she opened Family first. The photos hit her like a physical blow. Robert with people she had never seen before. Robert with an older couple who appeared to be in their 70s, his arms around them at what looked like a birthday party. Robert with a woman about his age, their similar smiles suggesting they were siblings. In every photo, Robert looked relaxed, happy, familiar with these people. "But you told me you were an only child," Grace said to the screen. "You told me your parents died before we met." She scrolled through more photos. Holiday gatherings, a fishing trip, a graduation ceremony where Robert stood proudly next to the woman who might be his sister. According to the dates, these photos had been taken throughout their marriage, some as recently as 2 months before his death. Grace's hands trembled as she backed out of the folder and opened Correspondence. Thousands of emails appeared, organized into subfolders. She clicked on one labeled Elena and found years of exchanges between Robert and a woman whose email signature identified her as Elena Richardson, Chief Financial Officer at a company in Boston. The emails started professionally enough, discussions about investments, market trends, client meetings. But as Grace scrolled back through time, she saw the tone shift. Personal details began to appear. Inside jokes, references to dinners and weekends, plans for trips. A cold feeling spread through Grace's stomach as she opened an email from 3 years ago. "William, I've been thinking about what you said last weekend. I agree that we should take the next step. Life is too short to wait for perfect timing. I love our condo, but I think we should look for a house with a yard. Somewhere with more space for the future we talked about. Let me know what you think. All my love, Elena." William, not Robert. Grace stared at the screen, the implications sinking in. Robert had been living as William with this woman in Boston. The condo she had found paperwork for, they had been sharing it, and they had been planning a future together. But there was something off about the emails. Elena never mentioned visiting Robert in his home city. There were no references to his business trips or his other life. It was as if, to Elena, Robert, or William simply existed in Boston. His life elsewhere didn't factor into their relationship at all. Grace backed out and clicked on a folder labeled Chicago. Similar patterns emerged. Emails with colleagues and friends, all addressing Robert as David Miller. Photos of social gatherings and apartments she'd never seen. In one photo, Robert, David, stood on a balcony overlooking Lake Michigan, his arm around a woman named Natalie, according to the email thread discussing the photo. "Were you married to her too?" Grace whispered, her throat tight. She searched for marriage certificates or references to weddings in the Chicago folders, but found nothing conclusive. The relationship with Natalie seemed serious but not necessarily legal. There were emails about shared vacations, joint investments, even a dog they apparently co-owned, but no clear evidence of marriage. In the Boston folder, however, she found what she had been dreading: a scanned copy of a marriage certificate. William Turner and Elena Richardson, married 5 years ago at a courthouse in Boston. 5 years. Almost exactly when Robert had started traveling for work more frequently. Grace closed her eyes, trying to process what she was seeing. Robert hadn't just been living separate lives, he had legally married another woman while still married to Grace. He had committed fraud, bigamy, identity theft. When she opened her eyes again, she forced herself to keep searching. There had to be more to the story. People didn't just create elaborate double lives for no reason. In a folder labeled History, Grace found documents that made her breath catch. Medical records from 15 years ago, before she had met Robert. Psychiatric evaluations. Treatment plans for dissociative disorders. Notes from therapy sessions discussing compartmentalization and identity formation. "Were you sick?" Grace asked the screen. "Is that why you did this?" But the medical records ended shortly before she and Robert had met, and nothing in his behavior during their marriage had suggested psychological problems. He had been forgetful, sometimes distracted, but otherwise normal, loving, present, or so she had thought. Grace clicked on the email application and found that Robert maintained separate email accounts for each of his identities. Each account had thousands of messages, evidence of full, active lives being lived simultaneously. How had he kept track of it all? How had he managed the complexities of these separate existences without ever making a mistake that would reveal the truth? As the afternoon light faded to evening, Grace found herself in a folder labeled Finance. Spreadsheets detailed income and expenses for each of Robert's lives. The money came from investments, consulting work, and what appeared to be a legitimate business in each city. He hadn't been stealing or running scams. He had been actually working, earning, and managing money in 3 separate lives. One document caught her eye, a file named Contingency. Inside was a detailed plan for what should happen if Robert/William/David died. Bank accounts to be closed, properties to be sold, people to be notified. But there was no mention of his different identities being revealed to each other. Even in death, he had planned to keep his worlds separate. Grace closed the laptop, her mind spinning. The man she had loved, the man she had married, had been living at least 2 other complete lives during their entire relationship. He had other homes, other jobs, possibly even other wives. And he had maintained this deception with a level of organization and attention to detail that seemed impossible for the Robert she had known. Tomorrow, she would need to decide what to do with this information. Should she contact Elena in Boston? Natalie in Chicago? The authorities? For now, though, she needed to sit with the knowledge that her husband had been a stranger, not just to her, but perhaps even to himself. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. She wasn't Robert's only wife. The property deeds weren't just investments or secret getaways, they were homes where he lived his other lives. Lives that included other women who, like her, had fallen in love with a man who didn't really exist. Grace sat in her car outside a sleek high-rise building in Boston, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. After 2 weeks of investigation, countless hours poring over documents and emails, she had made the 7-hour drive to see for herself. The address on the condo deed matched this building, where Elena Richardson, Robert's other wife, presumably still lived, still grieving for the man she had known as William Turner. "You can do this," Grace whispered to herself, finally releasing the steering wheel and reaching for her purse. The doorman looked at her with polite suspicion when she entered the lobby. This was the kind of building where strangers weren't welcome without an invitation. Grace had prepared for this. "I'm here to see Elena Richardson," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I have some personal items that belonged to her husband." It wasn't entirely a lie. In her bag was Robert's watch, one she had never seen him wear, but had found in the secret office with William engraved on the back. The doorman called up, and to Grace's surprise, Elena agreed to see her. As the elevator carried her to the 12th floor, Grace rehearsed what she would say, how she would break the news that would shatter another woman's world the way hers had been shattered. The woman who opened the door was not what Grace had expected. From the emails and photos, she had imagined someone glamorous, sophisticated. Instead, Elena was small and plain, with tired eyes and a hesitant smile. She wore sweatpants and a university sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. In her grief, she looked ordinary, human. "You said you have something of William's." Elena asked, inviting Grace inside. The condo was beautiful, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the harbor. Photos of Robert, William, and Elena were displayed prominently on shelves and walls. They looked happy together, just as happy as Grace and Robert had been in their photos. Actually, Grace said, her mouth suddenly dry, I need to tell you something about William, something you don't know. It took 2 hours to tell the whole story, to show Elena the evidence Grace had brought with her, copies of documents, printouts of emails, photos of Robert in his other lives. Elena moved from disbelief to anger to shocked silence as the truth unfolded between them. 12 years, Elena finally said, her voice hollow. I've been married to William for 12 years. How could I not know? Grace felt a strange connection to this woman whose life had paralleled her own without either of them knowing it. 15 years for me, she said quietly. We're both victims here. Through careful detective work and the information she had found on Robert's laptop, Grace had also discovered the third woman, Melody in Chicago, who had been with Robert, or rather David, for 8 years. They weren't legally married as far as Grace could tell, but they had lived together as partners, sharing finances, friends, and a life that neither Grace nor Elena had known anything about. The next day, Grace and Elena flew to Chicago together. The conversation with Melody went much the same way, though with more tears and angry outbursts. Melody was younger than both of them, more visibly devastated by the betrayal. He was going to propose next month, Melody sobbed, showing them the text messages where David had hinted at making their relationship official on their upcoming anniversary. He already had the ring. The jeweler called me after he died, asking if I still wanted it. In a hotel room that night, the three women sat together, trying to piece together the fragments of the man they had all loved. They compared stories, dates, habits. Robert had carefully crafted separate identities, separate stories, separate lives that never intersected. He told me he was an only child raised by his grandmother, Elena said. He told me his parents were missionaries who died in Africa, Melody added. He told me they died in a car accident before we met, Grace said quietly. As they talked, a composite portrait emerged, not just of Robert's deceptions, but of the man himself. He had been kind to all of them, thoughtful, loving. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries, keeping them all straight somehow. He had been attentive to their needs, supportive of their dreams. The lies were massive, but so was the care he had shown each of them. I found medical records, Grace told them, hesitating before sharing this final piece. From before I met him, he was diagnosed with a dissociative disorder. There was therapy, medication, but he stopped treatment right before we met. Are you saying he was mentally ill? Melody asked, wiping her tears. That he couldn't help it. I'm saying it's complicated, Grace replied. Maybe he created these separate lives because of his condition, or maybe he used his condition as an excuse to get what he wanted. I don't know which is true. By the third day of their strange reunion, the anger had begun to give way to practical concerns. Robert had left behind properties, bank accounts, investments. His careful planning had included details for what should happen if he died, but not what should happen if his separate lives discovered each other. We could contest the will, Elena suggested, fight each other in court. Or we could work together, Grace said slowly. Pool what we know, divide things fairly. Keep the legal system out of it. Why would we do that? Melody asked, suspicious. Because no one would believe this story, Grace said. Because dragging this into court would make everything public. Because we've all been hurt enough already. As they parted ways at the Chicago airport, the three women exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. They were connected now by something bizarre and painful, a shared experience that no one else could understand. They weren't friends, exactly, but they weren't enemies either. They were something for which there was no name, women who had unwittingly shared a husband who had loved the same man without knowing he belonged to others. On the flight home, Grace stared out the window at the clouds below, thinking about the man she had married. Had any of it been real? Had he truly loved any of them? All of them? She would never know. The heart attack had taken him before any of them could confront him with the truth. What remained was only questions, and three women left to rebuild their lives from the beautiful lies they had called marriages. 6 months had passed since the funeral. The coffee shop was busy that afternoon, with the hum of conversations and the gentle clinking of cups creating a comforting background noise. Lily sat at a corner table, nervously checking her watch every few minutes. She had arrived early, wanting to prepare herself mentally for this strange meeting. When Beth from Boston walked in, Lily recognized her immediately from the photos she had found in the secret room. Beth looked just as anxious, her eyes scanning the cafe until they landed on Lily. A flicker of recognition passed between them. They had never met, yet they knew each other's faces from pictures hidden in their husbands' secret files. "You must be Lily," Beth said, extending her hand with a slight tremble. Before Lily could respond, the cafe door opened again, and in walked Tina from Chicago. She was shorter than Lily had imagined, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The three women who had loved and lost the same man now faced each other with a strange mixture of camaraderie and discomfort. "I ordered us some tea," Lily said, gesturing to the pot on the table. "I figured we could all use something calming." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, each woman studying the others, looking for similarities, differences, trying to understand what Thomas had seen in each of them. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Tina finally said with a nervous laugh. "Meeting my husband's other wives. It's like I'm stuck in some bizarre TV show." Beth smiled sadly. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will all be a bad dream. That the Thomas I knew for 12 years wasn't this person who could lie so completely." Lily nodded, pouring tea into their cups. "For me, it's been about trying to separate the real from the fake. Was any of it real? The way he looked at me. The life we planned together." They had spent months unraveling Thomas's deceptions, sharing their discoveries in careful emails and occasional phone calls. Each woman had brought a folder to the cafe, filled with documents that painted a picture of a man who had crafted his lies with frightening skill. "The bank accounts go back 15 years, Beth said, spreading papers across the table, "before any of us met him." Tina pulled out her phone, showing the others a series of messages. "His brother in Seattle doesn't exist. I hired someone to check. The family photos were taken with actors." Lily still found it hard to believe how thoroughly Thomas had committed to his triple life. He had maintained separate phones, email accounts, even different allergies with each wife. With her, he couldn't eat shellfish. With Beth, he was allergic to peanuts. With Tina, it was dairy. "You know what hurts the most?" Lily said, stirring her tea. "Not just the lying, but knowing how much work he put into those lies. All that effort he could have put into one real relationship." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation shifted. They stopped talking about Thomas and began sharing stories about themselves, their childhoods, their dreams, the paths that had led them to this strange sisterhood of betrayal. "I'm going back to school," Beth announced. "I'd always wanted to study architecture, but Thomas thought it was impractical." Tina smiled. "I'm selling the house and moving to Portugal. I've always wanted to live by the ocean." Lily felt something unexpected as she listened to these women reclaiming their lives, a sense of possibility. The money they had recovered from Thomas's hidden accounts would give each of them a fresh start. As they prepared to leave, Lily looked at the faces of the women who shared her pain and her healing. They had come together as victims but were leaving as something else, survivors, maybe even friends. "We should do this again," Lily said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Walking home later, Lily felt lighter than she had in months. The truth about Thomas still hurt, but she no longer carried the weight of questions. In losing him, she had found something unexpected: clarity, freedom, and two women who truly understood what she had been through. Sometimes, she thought, the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one.